Today, the part-time amateurs at the RBA. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one of latest posts covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Now, there was a very good article in news.com highlighting the fact that the RBA is failing due to a lack of expertise. And that's based on information from former insiders. They said the RBA could soon see a major overhaul amid accusations that its 9-member board lacks economic qualifications. As inflation skyrockets and borrowers grapple with a sharply rising interest rate, a series of embarrassing missteps have focused public attention on the Reserve Bank like rarely before. With the new federal government preparing to undertake a once-in-a-generation review of the RBA, former insiders have delivered a blunt assessment of the institution responsible for setting Australia's monetary policy. The board is failing, and the reason it fails is because it lacks expertise, said Peter Tulip, former head of research at the RBA. Mr. Tulip, who has worked for the US Federal Reserve and is now with the Centre for Independent Studies, is one of a group of prominent economists, including former RBA board member Warwick McKibben, calling for a major overhaul of the central bank amid accusations its 9-member board lacks economic credentials. The majority of RBA appointments tend to be senior business people rather than economists. Currently, 5 of the 9 members have no experience setting monetary policy. In addition to RBA Governor Philip Lowe and Deputy Governor Michelle Bullock, Treasury boss Stephen Kennedy has a seat on the board, an unusual arrangement which other countries, including the US, have recognised may compromise the central bank's independence, with prominent economist Ian Harper rounding out the 4 experts. The 5 business people on the board are former Coca-Cola Amatil boss Alison Watkins, Mark Barnaby from Fortescue, philanthropist Carol Schwartz, CSL director Caroline Hewson, and scientist Wendy Craik. It is a bit of a caricature to say that if you know something about monetary policy, you'll almost be disqualified from being on the board, said economist Saul Estlake, who also signed the open letter to incoming Treasurer Jim Chalmers in May, calling for a wide-ranging independent review of the RBA's operations and structure. There's a convention that there's one academic economist on the board. Ian Harper, in particular, is capable of playing an important role. The others are business people, supposedly because of their experience in decision-making under uncertainty. Mr. Estlake said he was not disputing that those board members were all credible, experienced business people, but I would ask, do the majority of the board need that skill, he said. Have other central banks perform more poorly because they don't have that skill on board? The review, expected to begin either this month or next month, should encompass the Reserve Bank Act, the Statement on Conduct of Monetary Policy, and the RBA as an institution, including its responsibilities, its structure and culture, the composition and appointment of its boards, and the way in which it communicates with the public, the economist said in the letter. The review presents a once-in-a-generation opportunity, they wrote. Recent decades have seen the Australian economy buffeted by unprecedented external shocks, which have necessitated rapid adaptation of both monetary and fiscal policy. Meanwhile, economies around the world have experienced a long-run secular decline in economic growth and real interest rates. Now is the time for a wide-ranging independent review of our monetary policy framework and our monetary authority. Mr. Tulip, who spent 9 years at the RBA, said while some of the board do have subject matter expertise was not a requirement to be on the board. He said an analogy would be if another big decision-making board in the papers at the moment, the Australian Technical Advisory Group on Immunisation, ATAGI, started appointing business leaders to make decisions on vaccines. Monetary policy involves technical decisions, he said. The objectives of monetary policy are essentially decided by the government and settled 2 to 3% inflation and unemployment. It's a technical question of how you achieve those objectives. It's not an issue of values or representing the community. There is a misunderstanding of the role of the board. People think it's meant to represent community values. It's not. Mr. Tulip said the RBA needed to consult widely and that all groups of society need to be taken into account in monetary policy, but that should be done with a formal liaison program, as in fact the RBA has. You don't want to rely on the unrepresentative anecdotes of one random board member, he said. In terms of decision making, you want experts making those decisions, not part-time amateurs. And he added, they're very bright and talented people, but most of them lack the training to be able to say, Phil, doesn't the research say the opposite? Mr. Tulip said the RBA had made well-documented mistakes, including as outlined in a recent paper by new Assistant Treasurer Andrew Lee and Dr. Isaac Gross, published in the Journal of Economic Record. They concluded that prior to the pandemic between 2016 and 19, the RBA left rates too high in order to target financial stability rather than its statutory objectives, leading to falling economic growth, stagnant wages, and below target inflation. The result was an extra 270,000 people unemployed for a year, they calculated. Another example, Warren McKibben, has documented how in the 80s they left rates far too high because they were targeting the current account deficit, Mr. Tulip said. Paul Keating has routinely argued that the bank moves too late to change interest rates. All of these reflect analytical errors, and they would not have persisted were the bank more open and honest with the Australian public. If there were clearer communication, errors will be exposed more quickly. And more recently, critics say the RBA badly dropped the ball by leaving rates too low for too long and has now been left scrambling in the face of skyrocketing inflation. While some central banks, including New Zealand, began rising rates as early as last year and the US Federal Reserve started in March, Australia's central bank waited until May to finally act as consumer prices rose at their fastest pace in 2 decades. May's increase of 25 basis points was the first since 2010, lifting the official cash rate from its record low emergency level of 0.1%. That was followed by back-to-back 50 basis point increases in June and July, bringing the cash rate to 1.35%. They were very late to recognise the inflation problem they had, said Mr. Eslake. They've got some catching up to do. I think they've made some mistakes. But unlike others, Mr. Eslake says he doesn't blame the RBA for fueling Australia's housing bubble, instead pointing the finger at regulators like APRA being asleep at the wheel and federal and state governments inflating prices with policies like first homeowner grants. But Mr. Eslake says one big mistake in the post-COVID period was putting a date on how long rates would remain low. As far as I'm aware, no other central bank in the world put a date on it, he said. Certainly they put economic criteria, unemployment and inflation objectives, but only the RBA put a date on it. And local borrowers aren't the only ones upset with the RBA. Offshore bond investors are reportedly shunning Australia after the central bank's failure to provide reliable guidance on inflation and interest rates. Bloomberg reported that the bank's forecasting, which Dr. Lowe conceded had been embarrassing, has added to reputational damage done by the RBA's disorderly exit from the yield curve control last year. Yield curve control, a type of bond buying scheme designed to stimulate the economy while interest rates were low, was also used by the RBA to underscore its forward guidance with no rate rises until 2024. The market's confidence in the Reserve Bank of Australia's messaging has definitely taken a hit, Prasad Nuha, a Singapore-based rate strategist at TD Securities, said. Significant losses from market participants and lack of credibility and guidance have led investors to make a conscious decision to move to the sidelines. Dr. Lowe had previously defended himself over past statements that rates would not rise until 2024, saying the economy didn't evolve as we expected. I understand that people will make borrowing decisions based on our communication, and people took out loans that they may not have otherwise taken out, he told ABC 7:30 last month. I'll also point to the fact that the economy has done remarkably well. The unemployment rate is at a 50-year low. A higher share of population has a job than ever before, and households have built up very large financial buffers. Over the past couple of years, people have put away an extra $250 billion. It's a lot of money, and the savings rate is still high, and the number of people who've fallen behind on the mortgage is actually declining, not rising. Mr. Eslake said he hoped the review would result in either a recomposition of the RBA board to emphasise economic expertise, or for the establishment of a separate monetary policy committee to make interest rate decisions. I would like the review to conclude the conduct of monetary policy would be enhanced if there were more knowledgeable voices around the table, he said. And why can't we see members of the Monetary Policy Committee offering opinions from time to time? It would make for better monetary policy and public understanding of monetary policy if the public had more insight into the diversity of opinion rather than just having collective voice in the minutes. Mr. McKibben, who served on the board for 10 years until 2011 and is now at the Cranford School of Public Policy at the ANU, was named in a secret US Embassy cable from 2009 revealed by WikiLeaks in a rare insight into the inner deliberations of the RBA during the height of the financial crisis. Dr. Kennedy, then Chief Macroeconomic Advisor to Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, told the Americans that he and his Treasury Department colleagues are increasingly frustrated with the RBA, the cable said. They were particularly annoyed with Mr. McKibben, who had swayed some of his colleagues to his view that further rate cuts were not needed as China will recover in the second half of 2009, which will pull Australia out of recession in the same time frame. The reason I can say some of these things is because they're in WikiLeaks, Mr. McKibben told the Saturday paper earlier this month, because Kennedy told somebody in the American embassy, who then reported back to Washington that I was a pain in the you-know-what. Isn't that a sad situation, that you cannot find out what's going on in the institution that's supposed to be acting in the national interest unless you go to WikiLeaks? Well, here's the point. If you're going to do a review of the RBA, you must include APRA as well, and you also need to look at the Council of Financial Regulators, because of course that is the peak body where the RBA and ASIC and APRA and the Treasury all get round the table and chat to each other. There is really no accountability from that group, and in fact very little accountability anywhere. So as well as looking at the structural issues, I think there needs to be a very significant discussion about accountability. Who says what? Who is accountable for saying what? And whether they get it wrong, what happens? Because let's face it, the RBA is a bit of a traffic accident at the moment, and yet there is no accountability at its door. Shame on them, because of course real Australians and real businesses are being hit over the head by a 4x2 thanks to their poor decision making. That is not acceptable, that's not right. But I wonder whether the current review as proposed will get to the root of the issues. I guess we will wait and see. Now, if you're buying your home in Sydney's contentious market, you don't need to stand alone. This is the time you need to have Edwin Almeida from Ribbon Property Consultants standing alongside you. Buying a property is both challenging and adversarial. The vendor has a professional on their side. Emotions run high, price discovery and price transparency are hard to find, and then there's the wasted time and financial investments that you make. Edwin understands your needs, so why not engage a licensed professional to stand alongside you? With RPC, you know you have experience, knowledge, and master negotiators looking after your best interests. So shoot Ribbon an email at info@ribbonproperty.com.au, and if you use the promo code DFAWTW/Martin, you can get a 10% discount offer. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.